Transport is so much a part of our lives that we rarely think about it. Most travel is very local and takes place in familiar settings close to our home. But the journeys that stick in the mind are long-distance ones, taking us away on holiday or bringing us together with friends and relatives. The commonest experience of travel is the daily trip to work or school. 200 years ago, the Industrial Revolution began to change the rhythm of work, drawing people off the land, out of their houses and into factories and offices. Later, the Transport Revolution made it possible for the place of work and the home to be widely separated. Many of us now spend a large part of our lives going from one to the other. The kind of life we have can often hinge on the sort of transport that exists. And transport isn't there by accident. Technology by itself doesn't update a transport system. At every stage of development, government has had a hand in it, and policy has veered from non-intervention to strict control. Many decisions affecting us now happened long ago. By looking back, we can trace their influence through to today. You could go back and still trace connections with the present. But there are changes which seem symbolically to mark breakpoints between one kind of world and another. One of these was the coming of the railways. The railways blasted their way into the landscape and into the consciousness of the people. The massive disruption was initially felt very locally, but gradually spread, like the trains, to every nook and cranny. Strong feelings were voiced, some supporting the building of the railways, believing them to have advantages: better communication, greater opportunity for profitable investment, and financial benefit from the sale of land for those who had it to sell. Opposition came from those who feared the changes which the railways would bring. Some landowners wanted no intrusion on their estates. Innkeepers were worried about the effects of fewer coaches. Clergymen voiced fears about the impact of travel on the souls of their parishioners. And there was widespread concern that radicals and dissenters would crowd onto trains and import riot, uprising and discord wherever they went. The Duke of Wellington opposed railway building because it would encourage the lower orders to move about and nurture ideas about equality. Ironically, the transport of people hardly entered the plans of the early railway builders. The impetus came from the manufacturers and industrialists looking for better ways of moving raw materials and for new kinds of power. Rails were already in use. Men and horses had hauled wagons on them for centuries. Before 1800, steam engines were used to pump water out of mines, and rudimentary engines had been fitted to riverboats. But the combination of these elements brought about a revolution. The Stockton and Darlington, recognised as the first public railway to use steam, was opened in 1825. The event was lovingly commemorated 100 years later. The Stockton and Darlington was not designed to carry people. The first steam-powered railway intended for passengers was the Liverpool and Manchester. It was opened with great pomp and circumstance in 1830. Celebrities of the day were among the 50,000 spectators. The importance of the event was recognized at the time, as can be seen from the large number of jugs, headscarves and other souvenirs which were issued to commemorate the occasion. The early railways were built for freight traffic first and foremost. But once trains were available to the public, people poured onto them. In fact, until 1852, passenger takings exceeded the income from freight. Initially, passenger facilities were rudimentary. Even mainline termini were modest, like Paddington Station, seen here in 1843. 9 years later, it was rebuilt in a much more ornate style, designed to reflect the glory of the railways and to appeal to the Victorian passengers. The new stations were often compared to medieval cathedrals. Once the railways came, other forms of transport were doomed. The stagecoach operators went out of business as soon as a railway opened nearby. The canals, which had been the backbone of the Industrial Revolution, also suffered. The canal age rapidly gave way to the railway age. By the end of 1830, there were just 3 railways in operation. During the next 10 years, work went ahead so quickly that by 1840, the heart of the network was already in place. 1,500 miles of track had been laid, and most of the major towns were linked up. In the 1840s, new lines were built at such a rate that 4,500 miles of track were added, bringing the railways to many more towns and villages. By 1850, large towns had several stations belonging to different companies. The hectic pace of construction continued, and by 1860, another 4,000 miles had been added, bringing the total mileage of track to about 10,000. The construction of the network was an extraordinary undertaking, often thought of as purely an engineering feat. The work of the great engineers is still there for all to see, a monument to the skill of men such as George and Robert Stephenson and Eisenbach Kingdom Brunel. But the volume of work in building a railway was vast. Engineering drawings had to be made of every detail. On the legal side, documents had to be drawn up with the transfer of deeds of land and for binding contractors and subcontractors to the railway promoters. And the real work of building the railways fell to bands of navvies. Working in pairs, they had to shift over 30 tons of soil and muck a day. At the height of the railway boom, 250,000 of them were employed. It was very dangerous work with a lot of casualties. On one tunnel alone, between Manchester and Sheffield, 32 men died. The building of the railways also required a massive capital injection. By 1875, around £700 million had been absorbed by their construction. The rage for shares in this venture seemed to infect gentry, clergy and petty bourgeois alike, and railway mania was constantly in the headlines and was the subject of cartoons. Quick profits were the attraction, but railway building was a risky business. The cartoons derided the speculators with their extravagant and often competing claims. There was a narrow line between the speculator and the empire builder. One of the most controversial figures among the early entrepreneurs was George Hudson, the railway king. By 1848, he controlled railway companies worth £30 million and a third of the country's railways. Even royalty came to pay court to Mr. Hudson. But disaster came. He fiddled the books, had to resign his directorships and flee the country. Hudson was just one example of what could happen in an unregulated system of railway building. The British Parliament was reluctant to interfere with the railway companies, arguing that too much regulation would encourage irresponsibility in the owners. Belgium, by contrast, since 1834, had its mainline railways built and operated by the state. France had its routes determined by government engineers, with private companies being granted short-term leases. But in Britain, laissez-faire was the rule, though an Act of Parliament was needed to acquire the land and to compulsorily purchase it. Within the Board of Trade, a special department was set up eventually in 1844 to supervise the railways, and this became the means of communication between the government and the companies. Detailed plans had to be submitted to the Board of Trade for each new venture. Here they were processed before being presented to Parliament. This is just one part of the plans for an extension to the Great Western Railway. Parliament was easily subverted. Vested interest preoccupied the philosopher Herbert Spencer when he wrote Railway Morals and Railway Policy 100 years ago.
Consider the constant pressure of local interest. Remember the influence of legislators, prompted some by their constituents, some by personal aims. Observe the temptations under which lawyers are placed. Concede the urgency of the engineering profession. To the richer, of whom more railway making means more wealth. To the mass of whom more railway making means daily bread. Estimate the capitalist power of the contractor, whose unemployed plant brings heavy losses, whose plant, when employed, carries great gain.
One clear sign of the lack of control over railway building was that the distance between the running rails, the gauge, was not standardized. Inconvenience for travellers resulted. Changing gauges meant changing trains, and the different railway companies didn't always design their timetables to help travellers to make connections. A variety of gauges proliferated before standardization was brought in, but long after most companies had adopted a width of 4 foot 8.5 inches, Brunel's 7-foot gauge was still being used on the Great Western. The last broad gauge train left Paddington in 1892. The absence of planning also led to wasteful duplication. For instance, Reading had 2 stations, and in London, railway termini went up side by side. This lack of coordination has left its legacy. The notion of a free-for-all even applied to the use of the railways.
When they first were built, people thought that it would be possible for anybody to come to a railway line and put their own locomotives, their own trucks, their own carriages on the line, and pay a toll for the use of the railway. In other words, that railways were going to be used just like the turnpike roads and the canals had been used. This, of course, was an utter disaster. There were so many collisions, so many blockages of the line, and eventually Parliament realised that it would have to give the railway companies a monopoly of the conveyance of goods and passengers.
The railways brought changes that couldn't have been foreseen. The habits that governed rural Britain could not easily fit in with the railways. Trains forced many changes on a sometimes unwilling society.
Each town had its own time, depending on its relation to the sun. The further west you went, the later it got in relation to Greenwich Mean Time in London. And the railways, once they built the long-distance lines, had to cope with the endless problems. For example, I've got a quote here from the Great Western Timetable in 1841, which says that London time is about 4 minutes earlier than Reading time, 7.5 minutes before Cirencester, and 14 minutes before Bridgewater, which of course is in Somerset further west. And eventually the railways, together with the telegraph and the post office, standardized time on the Greenwich Mean Time.
The railways encouraged standardization. Even the system of ticketing had to change. Handwritten tickets were phased out in favour of a machine-made product. With the railways came the paper bureaucracy. Thousands of clerks were employed to maintain records of all transactions and to account for the railway's finances. And managers had to be found to oversee the entire operation.
Army and Navy captains proved popular in the early years until the railway companies could recruit their own staff. Because they had the necessary experience of controlling large staffs, and they had the experience of managing in a disciplined atmosphere. So there was a military atmosphere in the railways, as there is in part still today. And in the early days, on some lines, employees were required to salute the trains as they passed by.
The railway workforce had to become servile. That was what the railway company had to do with this new staff, the like of which had never been seen before. Thousands of men herded together in railway workshops, in marshalling yards, in engine sheds. This was some kind of a Frankenstein monster which the railway company had created. They did not know how to control it. Every person who applied for a job on the railway would have to produce references, usually from the parson, The railways were very concerned to keep control of their staff. They wanted to know exactly who they had before they took a man on. And when they took him on, they destroyed him. The great myth of railway work is that of security of employment. It was not until 1919 that a regular day's work and a guaranteed week was afforded the railway men. There was no such thing as a day or a night. There was a turn of duty, and a man waited at his kitchen table with his overcoat and his sandwiches, ready to move at that call, on at once. And if he did not report for duty at once, he not only lost the day's pay, but he could actually be reprimanded, suspended, and even dismissed.
Railway workers were owned body and soul by the company. At Swindon, where the Great Western established its main works, a whole new town was built for the company to house its workers. Swindon barely existed before the railways came. In 1843, it had a population of 2,000, and within a short while, 7 times that number were employed in the railway works alone. There were several towns like this, direct railway creations, but just the presence of a railway line affected town growth. Middlesbrough in 1830, when the railways came, was a small coastal village with just one farm. But almost at once it became a busy port. By 1840 it had a population of 5,000, and by 1860 21,000 people lived there. Resorts such as Blackpool boomed with the coming of the railways. All over Britain, towns expanded. The railway speeded up a process that was already underway as people left the land to find work in the cities. The destruction wrought by the railways on city centres is difficult to grasp. They took land for their termini, land for their goods yards, and of course land for their hotels, which would be needed by wealthy patrons. They tore down housing in main cities, driving their lines through the poorer areas. When the Great Eastern Railway built its terminus at Broad Street in London, there were mass evictions. Above the houses that remained rose the viaducts of the railways, forcing the poor to live in cramped ghettos, never to be far from the rumble of trains and the dirt and the smoke. Somerstown is a district of North London, sandwiched between the 3 great termini, Euston on the one side and St Pancras and King's Cross on the other. The coming of the railways to Somerstown created problems for the district which are still there today. Jean Kelly, a long-term resident and local community worker, is interested in how the Midland Railway Company affected her area.
They built St Pancras Station, which is a huge station that you see over there, and they built the hotel alongside of it. Then they bought this 14 acres here to develop a double-storied goods yard, which was a massive construction. The lower level was where the carts used to go in to do deliveries to all areas of London, and the upper level is where the railway trains used to come in, the goods wagons used to deliver, and the goods used to be transported from the trains by a lift into the carts that used to deliver all over London.
The line north of the station ran right past the local church. Disinterring the dead left the residents shocked and outraged, but they were powerless to stop it. Nor could they prevent the railway reducing a quiet, semi-rural district to a noisy, grimy area with overcrowded, substandard housing. Little had changed by the 1920s, including the fact that most people living there worked for the railways.
Oh, my father, he was a van boy at the age of 14, and he used to drive the horses and carts. The stables were very sombre places to go and visit. They were under the arches and very, very dark. They were lit by little lamps in each archway, which was like a manger. and the water used to pour down the walls. The smoke and the smell of hay and the smell of stables, naturally, used to be matched with the sooty grime and the smog that used to collect underneath the arches because of the coal and because of the trains all working above.
Steam trains are now just a memory, and most of the old houses have been pulled down. But the past has not been entirely laid to rest.
My family is connected to the area, and we go back 5 generations, and I have had a lot of experience both through my work and as being a resident here. The people's resentment that so much land was taken for commercial reasons and so very little was ever given back.
The poor were the ones who suffered most and gained least from the construction of the railways. Fares were expensive, so the poor walked, just as they had always done. Only the scenery had changed. The railways were most interested in first-class passengers, people who paid well for their seats and might even buy railway shares. Third class was more crowded and less comfortable, often with wooden seats, no glass in the windows and no carriage springs. But the fares were not low enough for the majority of working people. A small step to changing this came with excursion trains. Travel to the Great Exhibition in 1851 cost 5 shillings from the north of England and was aimed at working men and women, for whom it would be about a day's pay. Passengers besieged the trains. For many, it was their first taste of railway travel. But going to work by train was still too expensive for wage earners, except on a few special workmen's trains, which Parliament forced the railway companies to run, one early in the morning and one in the evening, scheduled so that the wealthier passengers could avoid mingling with the masses. The idea of running regular excursion trains rather than occasional ones for special events began to appeal to many companies, and by the end of the century they were commonplace. By then, taking a break away from home was widespread among the middle class, and the idea of an annual holiday was included in most families' ambitions. And the holiday nearly always began with a railway journey. The first experience of travelling by train could be a very daunting one. One traveller, in the pioneer days, Thomas Creevey, an MP, found the whole thing frightful and said it was impossible to divest himself of the notion of instant death. But for the actress Fanny Kemble, writing of her first journey on one of the very early passenger trains, it was the thrill of a lifetime.
You can't imagine how strange it seemed to be journeying on thus, without any other visible cause of progress, other than the magical machine with its flying white breath and rhythmical, unvarying pace between these rocky walls. The engine was set off at its utmost speed, 35 miles per hour, swifter than a bird flies. You cannot conceive what that sensation of cutting the air was. When I closed my eyes, this sensation of flying was quite delightful and strange beyond description. Yet strange as it was, I had a perfect sense of security and not the slightest fear.